In the spring of 1967, tension across the Middle East was reaching a breaking point. Israel had already been facing threats from multiple sides: Egypt to the south, Syria to the north, and Jordan to the east. Yet among all the regions at stake, one city carried a weight unlike any other: Jerusalem. A city revered by Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike, it had been divided since 1948. The western part was controlled by Israel, while the eastern half, including the Old City and the Western Wall, remained under Jordanian control. For nearly 2 decades, barbed wire, walls, and checkpoints cut the city into two, with families separated, religious sites restricted, and an uneasy silence hanging over the streets. For the people of Israel, East Jerusalem represented both spiritual longing and national pride. The Western Wall, the last remnant of the Second Temple, stood just beyond reach in the Old City. Jews were forbidden from praying there, and for many, this was a wound that never healed. Jordanians, meanwhile, considered their hold on Jerusalem both strategic and symbolic. King Hussein of Jordan, although cautious, had aligned himself with Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser in the tense days before war broke out. The Arab world presented a united front, at least on the surface, and Israel knew that a conflict over Jerusalem could ignite not just battles, but an existential struggle for survival. When war erupted on June 5, 1967, it began with Israel's lightning strike against Egypt's Air Force. Within hours, most of Egypt's planes were destroyed, giving Israel total control of the skies. But even as Sinai burned, eyes in Israel turned toward Jerusalem. The Israeli leadership, under Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, initially tried to avoid opening another front with Jordan. Messages were sent to King Hussein, urging him to stay out of the war. Yet Hussein, relying on misleading reports from Nasser that Egypt was winning, ordered his troops to attack. By the afternoon of June 5, Jordanian artillery rained shells onto West Jerusalem, damaging homes, hospitals, and even the Knesset. Civilian life was thrown into chaos as air raid sirens echoed across the city. For Israelis, the shelling was both terrifying and infuriating. Families huddled in basements, children clung to parents, and fires broke out across neighborhoods. Yet the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, knew they had to act decisively. The Jerusalem Brigade, supported by paratroopers, was tasked with securing the city. What lay ahead would be some of the fiercest urban fighting Israel had ever faced. As the sun set on the first day of war, the battle lines in Jerusalem were drawn. Jordanian forces held fortified positions in East Jerusalem, including the Old City walls, Ammunition Hill, and the strategic Latron area to the west. These positions had been strengthened for years and were considered nearly impenetrable. The Jordanians were equipped with artillery, mortars, and British-supplied Centurion tanks, while the Israelis faced the daunting task of advancing on foot through narrow streets, stone houses, and minefields. Every alleyway could be a trap, every hilltop a stronghold. On the night of June 5, Israeli commanders met to plan their assault. At the center of this effort was Colonel Mata Gur, commander of the 55th Paratrooper Brigade. His men were experienced, many of them veterans of earlier conflicts, but the mission they now faced was unlike anything before. To reach the Old City, they would have to break through Ammunition Hill, a heavily fortified Jordanian base guarding the way. It was said that taking Ammunition Hill would require courage, sacrifice, and relentless determination. Few soldiers would leave unscarred. By dawn on June 6, the paratroopers advanced toward Ammunition Hill under cover of darkness. Machine guns blazed, mortars exploded, and the smell of gunpowder filled the air. The Jordanians fought fiercely, refusing to surrender even as Israeli soldiers pressed closer. Combat was brutal, fought at point-blank range in trenches and bunkers. Soldiers hurled grenades into enemy positions, sometimes only meters apart. It was not the sweeping maneuver warfare of the desert. It was raw, intimate, and personal. Young men on both sides found themselves in life-or-death struggles where hesitation meant death. Hours dragged on as the paratroopers clawed their way forward. Casualties mounted. Many Israeli soldiers fell, but their comrades pressed on, fueled by the knowledge that this battle was not just about a hill. It was about the path to Jerusalem. By midday, the fighting had slowed, and silence gradually replaced the thunder of gunfire. Ammunition Hill had been taken, but at a terrible cost. 71 Israeli paratroopers were killed, alongside hundreds of Jordanian defenders. Survivors described the ground as soaked in blood, with shattered helmets and weapons scattered among the rubble. It was a victory, but one that carried the weight of sacrifice. For Israel, the fall of Ammunition Hill was a turning point. The road to East Jerusalem now lay open, though the old city itself remained in Jordanian hands. In Tel Aviv, the government debated their next move. Capturing the old city meant not only military risk, but also international consequences. The United Nations and world powers feared that any change in Jerusalem's status could spark a wider crisis. Yet for the soldiers who had fought and bled, the mission was unfinished. They had cleared the way, but the heart of Jerusalem still waited. As night fell on June 6th, Jerusalem was a city of contrasts. In the west, residents lit candles in darkened homes, listening to radio updates with anxious hearts. In the east, Jordanian soldiers tightened their defenses, preparing for what they knew was coming. And in the camps of the Israeli paratroopers, men sat quietly, exhausted yet resolute. Many whispered prayers, while others sharpened their bayonets or wrote hurried letters to loved ones. They knew the battle for Jerusalem was far from over. What lay ahead would decide not only the fate of the city, but also the destiny of a nation. The capture of Ammunition Hill had opened a door that had been closed for 19 long years. Yet, despite the victory, the Israeli leadership hesitated. The old city of Jerusalem was not just another military target. It was the beating heart of three great faiths, and any miscalculation could have consequences far beyond the battlefield. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol and his cabinet debated throughout June 6th and into the night. Some urged restraint, fearing international backlash, while others argued that history had presented Israel with an opportunity that might never return. To the paratroopers waiting outside the city walls, the hesitation was unbearable. They had seen friends fall in the blood-soaked trenches of Ammunition Hill, and they felt the mission remained incomplete. Meanwhile, in East Jerusalem, Jordanian forces fortified their defenses. The old city, with its ancient stone walls and narrow passages, offered a natural stronghold. Snipers took positions in towers and rooftops, while mortars were readied in hidden courtyards. The Jordanian Arab Legion, regarded as one of the best-trained armies in the region, prepared to make the Israelis pay dearly for every step they took. The atmosphere was tense, and civilians inside the old city huddled in fear, listening to the sounds of distant artillery and waiting for the inevitable clash. On the morning of June 7th, orders finally came down from the Israeli High Command. The paratroopers were to move into East Jerusalem. The decision had been made. Colonel Madager gathered his men and delivered the words they had been waiting to hear. Their mission was clear: advance through the old city gates, secure the holy sites, and reunite Jerusalem under Israeli control. For many of the soldiers, this was not just a battle. It was a fulfillment of a dream carried by their parents and grandparents, a dream of return to the heart of their spiritual homeland. The assault began with heavy fighting in the areas surrounding the old city. Israeli tanks and infantry moved cautiously through the neighborhoods of Sheikh, Jarrah, and Mount Scopus, encountering fierce resistance. Jordanian machine gun nests and artillery pieces unleashed fire, forcing the Israelis to fight block by block. Civilians fled through the narrow streets, carrying what belongings they could, while the thunder of battle shook the ancient stones of the city. The smell of smoke and cordite filled the air, mingling with the cries of the wounded. As the paratroopers pressed forward, they encountered deadly ambushes. In one street, a group of soldiers found themselves pinned down by snipers firing from high windows. They responded with grenades and machine gun bursts, shattering stone walls and silencing the enemy one position at a time. The fighting was brutal, intimate, and chaotic. Unlike the open battles of the Sinai Desert, Jerusalem was a labyrinth where every corner held danger. Communication was difficult, visibility was poor, and decisions had to be made in split seconds. The courage of small squads often determined the outcome of entire engagements. Despite the intensity of resistance, momentum was on Israel's side. The Jordanian forces, cut off from reinforcements and overwhelmed by Israeli air superiority, gradually began to fall back. Still, every meter gained came at a cost. Soldiers fell in courtyards and alleys, their comrades pressing on with grim determination. For the paratroopers, the thought of the Western Wall waiting just beyond those ancient gates gave them strength. Many whispered prayers as they advanced, bullets ricocheting around them, their boots pounding the stones of streets unchanged for centuries. By mid-morning, Israeli forces reached the Damascus Gate, one of the main entrances to the Old City. The gate loomed tall, a symbol of centuries of history and conflict. The Jordanians had fortified it heavily, determined to hold the Israelis outside. Yet under covering fire, Israeli sappers blasted openings, and paratroopers surged forward. The battle at the gate was fierce, with grenades and gunfire echoing between the walls. Smoke billowed upward, darkening the sky. Slowly, through sheer determination, the Israelis broke through, forcing the defenders to retreat deeper into the Old City. Inside, the streets narrowed into tight, winding alleys where armored vehicles could not follow. The paratroopers moved in squads, clearing house after house, searching for hidden snipers and strongpoints. Civilians peered fearfully from shuttered windows, unsure whether to welcome or resist the intruding soldiers. Some waved white cloths, hoping to avoid the wrath of battle. Others stayed hidden, praying that the violence would pass them by. For the soldiers, the Old City was a maze of history and danger, where every archway could conceal an ambush. One of the fiercest clashes took place near the Lion's Gate, where Jordanian defenders staged a desperate stand. Mortar shells exploded around the Israelis, sending shards of stone flying. Yet the paratroopers pressed forward, their discipline and training carrying them through the chaos. Inch by inch, they forced the Jordanians back, until finally the resistance broke. The gate was in Israeli hands. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, Israeli soldiers stood inside the Old City. The moment was electrifying. Many soldiers wept openly, overcome by the weight of history. They had not yet reached the Western Wall, but they knew they were close. The city that had been divided by war and politics was within their grasp. The cost had been high, and the dangers were not over, but the dream of a united Jerusalem was now a reality waiting to be seized. As the sun rose higher over the ancient city, the paratroopers pushed deeper toward the Temple Mount. The golden dome of the rock glistened in the light, a reminder of the city's universal significance. For Jews, Muslims, and Christians alike, these stones carried meaning that transcended borders. For the soldiers advancing through the alleys, it was not just a military conquest, it was a spiritual homecoming. Radios crackled with updates, commanders shouted orders, and the sound of boots echoed through the narrow streets. The heart of Jerusalem was only steps away, and with it, the destiny of a nation. The Lion's Gate had fallen, and with it, the path into the heart of Jerusalem had opened. For the paratroopers of the Israeli Defense Forces, this was the moment they had dreamed of but never truly believed they would see. The narrow alleys of the Old City stretched before them, echoing with the sounds of war. Gunfire rattled from distant corners, but the resistance was crumbling. The Jordanians who had once sworn to defend the holy city at all costs were retreating, overwhelmed by the relentless Israeli advance. Step by step, the paratroopers moved forward, their hearts pounding not only from the adrenaline of combat, but from the knowledge that history itself was unfolding around them. Colonel Madagur's voice crackled over the radio, carrying words that would become legendary. "The Temple Mount is in our hands." Those 7 words signaled more than a military achievement. They marked the end of 19 years of division and the fulfillment of a centuries-old yearning. Soldiers stopped in their tracks, overcome by emotion, as the magnitude of what they were achieving sank in. Many could barely believe it. For the first time since 1948, Jewish soldiers were standing inside the Old City of Jerusalem, reclaiming sites sacred to their people. The path to the Western Wall was not without danger. As the paratroopers advanced deeper into the city, scattered Jordanian snipers and holdouts still fired from rooftops and hidden positions. The Israelis responded with precision, clearing buildings methodically while keeping their eyes fixed on their ultimate goal. Every turn in the labyrinthine streets brought them closer to the sacred heart of Jerusalem. The tension was unbearable, yet the soldiers pressed on, knowing that the eyes of their nation, and indeed, the world, were upon them. Finally, they reached the broad plaza before the Temple Mount. Before them rose the ancient stones of the Western Wall, weathered by centuries, revered for millennia. For many of the young soldiers, this was the first time they had ever laid eyes on the wall in person. The sight was overwhelming. These were men hardened by days of battle, men who had lost friends on Ammunition Hill and in the alleys of East Jerusalem. Yet here, in this moment, the weight of history broke through their armor. Many wept openly, tears streaming down dust-covered faces. Some fell to their knees, pressing their foreheads to the stones. Others stood in silence, stunned, their rifles slung at their sides as they touched the wall with trembling hands. Rabbi Shlomo Goren, the chief rabbi of the army, soon arrived carrying a Torah scroll and a shofar. Surrounded by soldiers, he recited ancient prayers that had echoed through Jewish history for thousands of years. When he blew the shofar, its haunting sound carried across the plaza, mingling with the cries of the soldiers and the rumble of battle still faintly audible in the distance. It was a sound of triumph, of grief, of return. For many, it felt as if the centuries of exile and longing had ended in that single, electrifying moment. Journalists and photographers who had followed the paratroopers captured the scene, and within hours, the images spread across the world. Soldiers leaning against the wall in exhaustion and ecstasy, Rabbi Goren with his Torah and shofar, young men in dusty uniforms embracing one another. These became the defining symbols of the Six-Day War. To Israel and Jews worldwide, it was not only a victory of arms, but a spiritual homecoming. The wall, long cut off by barbed wire and no man's land, was once again accessible. Yet amid the celebration, there was also grief. The cost of reaching this moment had been high. Names of fallen comrades weighed heavily on the soldiers' minds. Some stood silently, remembering those who had not lived to see this day. Others clutched photographs of loved ones, whispering prayers of thanks and sorrow. In the shadow of the wall, triumph and mourning intertwined, as they so often do in war. For the Arab inhabitants of the Old City, the scene was one of shock and uncertainty. Many had fled in fear as the Israelis advanced, while others remained hidden in their homes, unsure of what the future would bring. Some peered cautiously from windows and doorways, witnessing the surreal sight of soldiers celebrating at the wall. For them, it was a moment of loss and displacement. The city that had been under Jordanian control for nearly 2 decades had changed hands in just hours, and its future was now uncertain. Internationally, the capture of Jerusalem sent shockwaves. In the Arab world, the loss of the Old City was a humiliation beyond words. It was not merely a military defeat, but a spiritual and cultural catastrophe. The promise to protect Jerusalem had been broken, and the bitter memory of this loss would linger for generations. In Israel, by contrast, the mood was euphoric. Radios across the nation broadcast Madager's announcement, and crowds poured into the streets, singing and dancing in celebration. Parents embraced their children, strangers wept together, and synagogues overflowed with worshippers giving thanks for what they saw as a miracle. As the sun set on June 7, 1967, the paratroopers stood guard at the Western Wall. Exhausted, battered, and grieving, they nonetheless felt the weight of destiny pressing upon them. They had not only fought a battle, they had become part of a story that stretched back thousands of years. For them, the victory was not measured in kilometers of territory gained, but in the return to a place their ancestors had long dreamed of. The stones of the wall, silent witnesses to centuries of triumph and tragedy, now bore the touch of a new generation who had written their own chapter in Jerusalem's history. In the days that followed, as Israeli leaders debated the political future of the newly captured city, the soldiers continued to visit the wall, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups. They left notes in its cracks, whispered prayers, and remembered those who had fallen. The war was not yet over. Battles still raged in the Golan Heights and the Sinai. But for those who stood at the Western Wall, June 7th marked the fulfillment of a dream and the beginning of a new era. The city, divided no longer, had been reunited under Israeli control. What that would mean for the future was uncertain, but in that moment, amid tears, prayers, and the echo of the shofar, Jerusalem stood whole once again. The guns had fallen silent in Jerusalem, but the echoes of battle still lingered in the air. Smoke drifted above rooftops, mingling with the chants of prayers at the Western Wall. For the paratroopers who had taken part in the historic assault, the capture of the old city was the pinnacle of their service. Yet even as they touched the stones with trembling hands, they knew the war was not over. Across the Middle East, fighting continued in the Sinai, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. Jerusalem had been the emotional heart of the conflict, but the wider struggle was still unfolding. Within hours of the victory, word spread across Israel. Radios carried the announcement, Har Habit B'Yidnu, the Temple Mount is in our hands. The nation erupted in joy. Thousands poured into the streets of Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Jerusalem itself. Strangers embraced, tears flowed, and songs filled the night. For a people who had lived under the shadow of annihilation only days earlier, the victory felt nothing short of miraculous. In homes and synagogues, parents lit candles and whispered prayers of thanks. Children were told they would now be able to walk through the old city, to see the Western Wall with their own eyes. Generations of longing had suddenly turned into reality. Yet for the Arab world, the fall of Jerusalem was a bitter catastrophe. In Amman, Cairo, and Damascus, shock gave way to grief, then to rage. Radio stations mourned the loss of Al-Quds, describing it as a wound inflicted upon the entire Muslim world. For many, the humiliation cut deep. Arab armies, once confident of victory, had not only been defeated but had lost control of one of Islam's holiest cities. In speeches and newspapers, leaders vowed revenge. Crowds filled streets in protest, demanding accountability, demanding answers. The sense of betrayal was profound, for promises to protect Jerusalem had crumbled in the face of swift Israeli advances. The political fallout was immediate. In Israel, leaders debated what to do with the newly captured city. Should it be kept united under Israeli control? Should there be negotiations with Arab states? The decision, in the end, was swift and clear. Jerusalem would not be divided again. Israeli bulldozers moved into the old city, clearing houses near the Western Wall to create a large plaza for worshippers. This decision displaced many Arab families, adding to the grief and anger already boiling in the region. For Palestinians, the victory celebrated in Israel was experienced as the beginning of a new era of dispossession. Around the world, governments reacted with caution. In Washington, the United States marveled at the stunning Israeli military achievement, but worried about the consequences of occupying holy sites sacred to multiple religions. In Moscow, the Soviet Union denounced Israel's actions and accused it of aggression, pledging support to its Arab allies. At the United Nations, diplomats scrambled to draft resolutions calling for withdrawal from occupied territories and warning of the dangers of further escalation. The capture of Jerusalem had reshaped not only the map of the Middle East, but also the balance of global diplomacy. For the Israeli soldiers, however, the politics of the moment felt distant. They were consumed by the personal and spiritual significance of what they had achieved. Many returned to the wall again and again in the days following the battle. They brought friends, family, and comrades. Some left small notes between the stones, prayers written in haste, but with deep emotion. Others stood silently, reflecting on the friends they had lost on Ammunition Hill, at the gates of the old city, or in the Sinai desert. To them, the victory was stained with blood, but it was also infused with hope. They felt they had been part of something eternal, something larger than themselves. Across the Arab world, the sense of defeat was matched by a determination to recover. Leaders gathered in Khartoum later that year, issuing the famous 3 no's. No peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. The loss of Jerusalem hardened positions and deepened the conflict. What had once been viewed as a conventional war between states was increasingly seen as a struggle for identity, faith, and history itself. For Palestinians, the Six-Day War marked the beginning of a new phase of statelessness and occupation, struggles that would shape their future for generations. The spiritual dimension of the battle for Jerusalem also reverberated far beyond the Middle East. Around the globe, Jews who had long prayed facing the Western Wall felt an extraordinary connection to the soldiers who had reclaimed it. Pilgrimages to Israel surged, and photographs of paratroopers at the wall became icons of resilience and faith. For Christians, too, the unification of Jerusalem raised profound questions. as the city contained many of their own sacred sites. The Vatican and other religious institutions expressed concern about access and control, urging that Jerusalem remain a place open to all faiths. Muslims worldwide mourned the loss of Al-Quds to Israeli control, fueling a renewed sense of urgency in pan-Islamic movements. As days turned to weeks, the full scope of the Six-Day War's outcome became clear. Israel now controlled not only Jerusalem but also the West Bank, Gaza Strip, Sinai Peninsula, and Golan Heights. The stunning military success reshaped the strategic map of the Middle East. Yet with victory came responsibility. The question of what to do with the newly occupied territories would dominate Israeli politics for decades to come. For many Israelis, the victory of 1967 was the beginning of a new chapter of hope. For many Arabs, it was the start of an enduring tragedy. Even today, the echoes of June 1967 remain. The images of soldiers at the Western Wall, of Mata Gur's declaration, of Rabbi Goren's shofar blast, they continue to resonate across time. To some, they symbolize the triumph of survival and faith. To others, they represent loss, displacement, and occupation. The Battle of Jerusalem was not just a moment in a war. It was a turning point in history, shaping the destiny of a city and a region whose story is still being written. And so, as the sun set on the sixth day of war, Jerusalem stood united for the first time in centuries. Soldiers kept watch at the gates, pilgrims wept at the wall, and leaders wrestled with the meaning of what had been won. The city of prophets, of kings, of countless generations had once again become the center of the world's attention. But whether the victory would bring peace, or whether it would ignite new flames of conflict, remained uncertain. What was clear was this: the Six-Day War and the capture of Jerusalem had changed everything. The battleground of 1967 would forever shape the battles of the future.